Welcome to the live stream, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host today, Bumpy McSquigums. We are the Indie Brothers, and we are doing our game industry discussion, defining job roles within game dev. I'm joined by Cupogoodness and a Tiny Disaster. Hello, everybody.
Hey, Bumpy. Hey, everyone. How's it going?
I am alive for now. Presently alive. All right, we got all the tweets out. We got everything ready to go. Stream Deck is nice, but it has this problem with Twitter. It doesn't like it for some reason. I don't know why. It's like every once in a while, it's like, you work exactly the way you're supposed to, and then it's like, all right, no, I don't feel like doing that now. What? Why? So then I have to manually do it. It's fine. It's fine. Everything's fine. So, what are we diving into on this day? Where would you like to start?
Yeah, I think we'll have to ringlead this between the three of us or Tiny Disaster if you want to talk about, hey, Missy, how's it going? Talk about it a little bit in terms of we have different categories of, areas of design and development and shipping that have to be considered for games, and how that sort of divvies up between the individuals that you have available to you and the budget you have available to find and hire more individuals potentially. So I think that's a good place to start, is that we understand that indie studios can vary anywhere from one person to like 100, up to 100 probably is probably fair. Once you get beyond that number, you're probably heading into the AA, AAA area, though that's not like, that's like more of a spiritual thing, not like the letter of the law or anything like that. I'm sure there's indie studios out there that are hundreds of people, but for the most part, you're looking at teams like Vertigo that are, probably 6 to 8 core members and about 12 to 24 additional contractual artists, voice actors, folks that come in every once in a while to do their thing. So yeah, lots of different things to go over. Like as a solo dev, obviously, what are you literally that Renaissance person that can do everything, or are there certain aspects that you bring in? Like some solo devs have a soundtrack person. Some solo devs have artists. So just things like that. Like, I'm not trying to say oh, if you're a solo dev, you have to actually do everything by yourself. Some people do, but that's usually on smaller scales and scopes. And that's another thing we'll talk about today, is the scopes of games and kind of how that plays into, how you define the teams, the roles, etc.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some sort of equation for figuring out how teams work within this industry. It's something like scope times budget divided by, I had it in my head, something like that. That there's no one exact way of looking at this. And I was trying to work out do we look at this solo dev up of okay, you start from doing everything, or from I don't even know what it would look like, but a AAA studio who has so many employees and a giant art team of what do all of those people do when you go down to the indie side and you have one person doing all of the art versus having 8 people doing textures? I don't even know how that all works. It's an interesting topic.
Right. Yeah. You can get a lot more iteration out of the AAA level because of just how many people can. It's it's like building the pyramids, right? Like a lot of people can get into that, and you can do some amazing things with the contributions of that number of people. But we talked about how you can lose things as well, like in translation of trying to translate hundreds of people's works into one product is a lot of times just doesn't translate as well as an indie project, which can come from either a single individual or a really tight knit group of individuals working on the project. So it is fascinating. There are choices obviously being made, and I wouldn't call them sacrifices necessarily, but things that indie developers aren't even going to consider that AAA devs get into and have teams for or individuals for, etc., etc. So yeah, this all kind of start with the idea of who is the person that wants to make this all exist, this is usually like the company founder, right, or the lead developer. Whether that can be the designer of the game, it might be the lead programmer of the game, it might be both of those people or both of those roles together as an individual person. That's how we see a lot of indie developers get started. Chris Park with Arcen Games, David Galindo with Vertigo Gaming, to name a couple. But as things go on, they might actually like we have Vertigo now. We have a lead programmer that's not David anymore. Like he's now been able to step into that design role, but this has taken over a decade of his time, right? Like when he started out with Cookstar Delicious, he was the lead programmer of that game. So it's interesting to think about how when you start, you're probably going to be taking on more roles, right? Like if you're not someone who is going on to a team as a specialist, and you're making your own game and you have your own ideas and you want to be an indie dev on your own, then likely you're going to have to be the owner of your company, which, by the way, is completely its own thing that has to be taken into account for. Running a company is hard. It takes a lot of paperwork and pulls your attention on all these like little forms, documentations, keeping up with, the government and taxes and all this stuff that just don't even apply to a lot of the stuff that you'd want to do with your work with games. However, that's like, if you want to be like a commercially successful developer, a lot of times those are the steps that you have to take to put yourself in a position to, do so. Do you have to have a company to make money? No, but it gets complicated, especially I think in America, but probably in Canada as well. I'm not sure. When you don't have, certain qualifications or legitimizing touches on your business, like an LLC in America, for instance, it's a very common thing. Limited liability company, things like that. So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but right there is something that if you ever see someone who's like the founder of the company and you wonder, oh, they don't seem to be like heavily involved even in the game development, they must not be doing anything. Oh yeah, they're definitely doing something. A lot of times the people that are running the company that also do development stuff, that's almost like doing two jobs. Like it's very intense. No, you don't have to do something for your company every day to keep it running, but it's just something that is always kind of in the back of the mind, and you have to bring forward, and you have to set aside like business days, company days, focused taxes days, financially focused days on your calendar that you wouldn't necessarily expect when you first said, hey, I want to make a game and release it on Steam, etc. So something to consider there. And then from there, it's just like, to me, it's all about like, are you reaching the standards of what's expected with a commercial release based on the team that you have? Like the standards of art, the standards of gameplay, the standards of design, music, etc., etc. Like what we all, Tiny Disaster, Bumpy, McSquigums, Cup, Missy, everybody out there that buys games, sort of subconsciously expect when we put money down for a game, right? Like this is very vague, by the way. Like it's hard to define what these standards are, but it's this thing that we kind of know, right? When you see a game that is, kind of not worth its value, has bad art or is programmed poorly or just feels amateurish in the arena of a commercial release kind of situation where you're like, hey, I paid $15 for this, I paid $20 for this, etc. So I think that while that's hard to define, that's something that takes both, I think self-awareness and experience to gain more self-awareness on that in terms of where am I in terms of my programming, my design. Do I use an engine that helps me program? Do I know how to program, in my own with a coding language on my own? That kind of stuff. Do I make decent art, or is my art considered programmer art, which is not really, prime time, made for prime time, kind of like sales and stuff like that? It can be. A lot of indies have gotten by with programmer art because of great gameplay mechanics and like a great loop, but it can hold you back as well, right? Like not having great art, or at least passably, good art, can hold your game back.
Like, if you want to go if you're forced to go the programmer art route, there's an eye for style that you need. Like it has to be kind of deliberate looking almost, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you have to make a choice, 100%.
And you don't necessarily know whether or not you have that eye, so you do need some outside perspectives. And going into it with kind of a look and feel.
One really respected developer I talked to, who I'm not going to name, but he said, you either have taste or you don't. And I don't necessarily agree with that. But I do think that it's something, because I think you can teach yourself to have better taste. You can educate and learn and like kind of feel that out based on, I think, sociology, like the properties of society and like being able to engage and understand how society works. You may have your own taste and stuff like that, but you can still translate and understand what the general public wants, or what, like certain niches of the public want, and how you could deliver that to them. I think that is extremely learnable, if that makes sense. Like, and so it's something that when I heard this person say that, I was like, I don't like the statement because it's really exclusionary. It's like, you either have taste or you don't. If you don't have taste, you shouldn't make games, like kind of thing. And I just didn't like. I like the way that was stated, because I feel like that's just saying, if you don't, it's one of those things where it's like, if you're not good at something right away, why ever try to be? And I really disagree with that, because I know that there's a lot of things that I've become really adept at and good at that I sucked at first. And so, like, I think that it's important to maybe look at that in the same way that, yes, there is a natural ability to understand, like a savant-like ability to have that. And great if you do, because you're going to be a step ahead, in a lot of spaces and in a lot of zones and stuff. But I don't think it should discourage you if you feel like you have to, go out and discover that and figure that out and earn that and through experience. Yes, I 100% agree that if you have programmer art, it needs to be something that is like, that has that taste, that has a vibe, that has something that captures that's not Uncanny Valley, or if it is Uncanny Valley, it's deliberately Uncanny Valley or something like that. Other than that, if you feel like you don't have that within you to just know whether or not you have that style down quite yet, then that's where you shop around. That's where you test and ask for feedback through social medias, through subreddits, through various forums and stuff, that you can communicate with people who will give you honest feedback on your work.
Yeah, when you'd first said either you have it or you don't, I thought you were going the route of like, you're either going to know, like, have a good sense of if your programmer art is going to be good enough, or you're just not. Because I've seen people in every artistic field ever think what they've created is amazing and it's so personal to them, but they can't see it objectively. And it's hard to know if you're someone who knows if
I suppose that's a
or not.
I suppose
but you
that's
can't absolutely learn.
Yeah, I suppose that's a growth self-awareness thing as well. Like, it's like, I love this. This is my style. I really, really, want this to be what other people appreciate. But if people are giving you feedback that's saying it's not working for them or something, then that has to be considered and potentially integrated into your style. Maybe not obliterating your style entirely, but let it evolve. Again, be the one that has the reins on it and make the decisions to change. You're in charge. It's your style, right? That kind of thing. But if you're getting that, it's just not something that is capturing, right, the audience like you want to. It is causing friction. It's holding them up. It's making them resist wanting to get into what you're building further. Then that's something that I think you really have to either say, okay, I need to change it up, or I may need to hire someone to come in and like do the art for me. And those are we've talked about this a million times before on the show. Those are like deep reflective things, constructive, deep introspective looks that you have to give on yourself and say, is this good enough? Am I good enough to do this? And if not, that's okay. I just need to find a solution that fits, if I can't get the job done myself. And a lot of times indies have to consider this across like all the different hats and all the different areas that we're going to be talking about. And I've already started talking about today, TD, is that they have to consider all these different areas, and are they good enough in those areas to get them done? And not just that, but do they have the headspace to do that as well? Like, you know what I mean? Like the human power that it takes to get all those things done, and the day to day that usually is going to wear one person down if it's more than one or two areas of those the different design areas we're talking about today. Sorry, development areas.
urging side of that discussion is that it can be done. Like, as we're talking about AAA studios and teams of texture artists and all of that, you do not need that to make a good game.
Nope.
Like, there are so many different art styles you can use now, so many different assets that are out there as jumping off points. There's a million things you can do to not have to spend more than you can afford in order to have good enough art for people to play your game. That can be done. There's a community out there who will help you get there, but it's a lot to think about.
I think it's like similar to becoming an artist. Like you want to use the resources and tools out there. You're going to learn about them, interact with them. If you don't have that basis already that base already of like programming language or how you would personally make a game, then you have to go out there and kind of find that. And from there, you kind of level up, right? Like you start using programs resources to allow you to create, and then you kind of assess your creations and decide how you want to level up for each kind of next creation you do, right? Next project, so to speak. And that might, and I mean, that's kind of how David went about building out Vertigo, is that each title he released, he sort of assessed and said, what, now that we're on this new title, what new thing can I bring to the table? Like or can we bring to the table? And what does that require? Is that something that I can get done? Is that something that we as a company within our current roster can get done, our team members, or do we go outside and hire someone new? And a lot of times it's the latter, and that's why the team that's going to be on CSF is going to be the biggest team that's worked on anything on Vertigo. As far as like team numbers on Vertigo games, it's going to probably be double what any of the other games have been over the last couple of releases, like CSD 3 and 2.
Is he saying that I'm ashamed to say this, but the art of a game is something that catches her eye? Not AAA art, but there's a level that can make her more interested as opposed to less. And for her, Loop Hero looks horrible, but was an amazing game. Whereas I was kind of in the other camp for that one. I was like, this looks interesting. Certain parts of it that looked okay, some not so much. And then I was very let down by Loop Hero. It's one of my biggest letdown games of all time for me. I was like,
So, I mean, there's like
that's it?
this.
That's the whole
Yeah,
game?
very much.
Oh.
A very much to each their own kind of situation, obviously, with that game. And I agree. Like a lot of indies can up their profile with fantastic art. The developer of Braid spent $250,000 on his art for an artist for that game that came out on Xbox Live Arcade. And while it wasn't maybe the greatest art ever, it brought about a style to it that the developer himself would never have been able to achieve. The programmer himself would have never been able to achieve, and it became one of the top selling Xbox Live Arcade games back in the day. Eventually got re-released on other things as well. But that's like one example that always comes to my head of like a solo developer who invested heavily in a specialist, in this case an artist, to kind of up the profile of their game. They knew they had a good game. They knew they had a gameplay that would probably capture people, or it was in that state where it's like, okay, this is a platformer kind of like story game that's going to really capture a certain demographic. But I need it to look good enough to sell and reach that demographic. I felt like that was his thinking on the matter, and that's how he kind of executed that. So that was back in like, I don't know, like 2008 or something like that, a long time ago. So maybe even 06, it's forever ago. But there's other games like that, that get those examples of. I guess my point is that make sure that you have a good game first before you invest heavily into art. But the art can take it to another level for sure, depending on the style, the profile, or like kind of just the look and kind of the style that it drips with, and what that means to people who come across it for the first time.
Battle Brothers had, I think, two brothers, ironically enough, that were starting. One had the idea, the concept of it. The other did the artwork, and then they had a third guy who was doing the programming. At some point, they had a writer as well. But the big thing that I think tied it together and what made it as successful as it has been is the music. Granted, every part works really well together, and anything on its own wouldn't be there. But they reached out and they found, I think they're all local. They're all within Germany, I think is where they're stationed. And they found a 2-man team that did all the music and stuff for them, and music's incredible. So I think that elevated the game beyond what they could have done normally. They recognized that and they sought something out to make that fill that gap.
That's a super great point. That if you take your time to find someone that is really like works really well for your games, AI War Pablo Vega, or Arcen Games Pablo Vega, Jonathan Gear for Vertigo, and he actually does other soundtracks for other games as well, notably Owlboy and a couple other ones. I can't remember. There's some other popular games he's working on as well. Like, you know, that style, 100% Bumpy's points out, just like the art point. If you are willing to find someone that is going to really work with your game seriously and put some amazing efforts into kind of matching the feel of the game based on how they as musicians see that, you can come up with arguably some of the best music you've ever heard, first of all, like just in any medium, and secondly, something that, like you said, is like Bumpy is like a benefit, a boon, another selling point for your game, if not potentially the selling point for in certain situations for certain people, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's like some music people are just like, I have to have this just because of the music. They're driven by that, and then the gameplay backs up by being good enough. That's a good space to be in as well. So again, you're not going to say, oh, I'm going to get a great soundtrack artist or a great just regular artist before I know I have a great game already. But those things can really elevate. And if you want to do them on your own, that's fine. But just know that's something that, you know, may unlock some doors for you if you seek out someone like professionally to help you out in those fronts.
Yeah, there's all sorts of different musicians as well. I mean, that's one of the things I feel more solo. I think that's probably the thing I hear most from solo developers or what have you, is either they buy or they get, like, I don't say generic, it sounds bad, but like
Royalty free,
duty-free or
yeah.
royalty-free
Yeah.
music, and they go with that, and it wasn't designed for their game. It's like, this
Right.
fits my game, but it's not designed for your game. And there is definitely a different feel when something is crafted specifically for what you're doing. So, but again, that's
Yeah.
something that from solo developers to just small indies, everyone seems to have a composer or something somewhere. That seems to be one of the things that people reach out for the most, because music is hard, right? Like, not everybody is musically inclined. So,
and like any electronic media or medium that's taken in with like audio, video, you know, there's that special connection that music can make with particular works if it was made for that particular work. I agree with that 100%. It's not magic. It's just it's something that's just it's just kind of a cool thing that can occur if everybody's on the same page and the artist can get it right in their collaboration. So that it's like greater than the sum. It's that old statement. It's greater than the sum of the parts when it comes together like that, which is really nice. And yeah, it creates those moments that a lot of times, yeah, from a marketing perspective, will lead to more word of mouth, right? Like, more people will want to talk about the game and suggest it and recommend it to others when you have those kind of moments with great art, great soundtracks, etc. So yeah, I mean, we're not running in circles, but the idea here is basically you have to have an understanding of this, or seek the understanding of, do I have a game that I feel is really solid, but certain elements could be elevated to take it to another level? And do I have the money to invest in this? And if I don't, do I want to seek that money out and try to get it through, just me privately personally working on side projects, work for hire, looking for funding opportunities like grants, indie funds, looking for a publisher. A lot of times it's tough to get a publisher if you don't have more of a complete project, but it depends on what the publisher's about. They may be looking for early on projects like prototypes, great loops and slices and things, vertical slices. of your game, things like that you don't necessarily have to have everything in quite yet, or at least you can have placeholders in. There's ways to placeholder in basically everything, and if the publisher understands that it's placeholder, then they understand that they can elevate that when it's time to, either on your end or through their funding for you. So something to consider there. Some other things we haven't talked about here. I'm trying to rack my brain here, looking over my notes on the
What about
the
just
weekly stream notes on Slack. Yeah.
from what you've experienced with the various companies you've worked with over the years, what are just different departments like?
Yeah, Q&A. Let's do this.
It's hard to fully grasp everything you're going to need to know to be
Right.
able to put out a game. So you're like going along and all of a sudden like, oh, I didn't even know that was going to be a job. So
It's true.
what do you think? What do you think the various different, like a list, so to speak?
Yeah, let's do some rapid fire questions with Bumpy and Tiny towards me, and then maybe anyone in chat wants to jump in as well. And obviously, you two have these experiences recently over the last couple of years as well. So if you feel like chiming in on any of this as well, please do. Don't let it be one-way traffic. But for me, you have to have a programmer, someone to build the game, right? The building blocks of the game. Generally, that programmer is a designer or is working very, very closely with a designer, someone who is putting together sort of the ideas of the game and how the flow should go and all that kind of stuff. And the programmer is taking all that design elements and trying to bring that to life in a real life situation.
So essentially, something like a creative director would be kind of like the owner or the idea guy. Would that be?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, well, a lot of times it is, right? Just by virtue of the fact that the person who wants to do that is the person who's like the main owner or director of the studio.
So they tend to work closely with at least a few people along the lines. On the smaller side, it would just be the direct, like the artists and such. But on like a larger scale, like even up to the AAA, where then you would have like an art director, and then that guy would go and deal with his, I won't say minions to minimize them,
yeah,
but, his crew, and then he would collaborate with the overall creative director.
And regardless, if you're at the top of the heat, you are communicating regularly with all of the departments, whether it's the top of those departments or going directly to the specialist artists because you're a smaller team, that kind of thing. If you're at the top of the heap of your company, one of your main jobs is consistently communicating and making sure that production is continuing in all the areas of development that needs to be continued on and stuff. So it's something that is pretty intense, right? So a programmer designer can be one person, but they're often that plus the company director, like you said, the coordinator, the owner, and that's a lot. There's a lot to take on there. So
structures of teams. It feels like decision making is kind of what's defining how these are shaped out. Because say you have an art director, they're going to be making a lot of those art decisions. But on a smaller team, you can't just have, even if you have someone who's solely responsible for art, you need to make sure the assets they're coming up with fit the style and the feel of the game that you're looking for. They cannot be solely responsible for it. There needs to be someone with the overall vision of the game, making sure the ship is kind of headed in the right direction.
Right, and that is generally the designer / creative director that's doing that, and oftentimes they're the programmer as well. So you have that. You obviously have. We talked about the artists. We talked about not just the soundtrack, but good to note that you often will need a sound designer for effects, for various other sounds in the game that are expected, maybe like UI, things like that, like where you would expect certain noises. You remember on like certain RPGs, like every move through the menu can make a little foop, 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 that kind of sound like that. Just different various stuff like that. You have, of course, you go to thinking about ourselves in like the Indie Brothers teams. You have potentially marketing directors or producers, or certainly social media management, community management, quality assurance is something that you can either do both internally. As an indie, I would suggest you do quality assurance both internally as something that basically everybody that wants to on your team basically commits to and participates in. And then additionally, you run private tests, alpha and beta, etc., with people who are not part of your team that are interested in just testing your game and giving you feedback on that kind of thing. So that's how I see kind of the quality assurance area covered, is that you likely aren't going to have enough members on your team and or hire someone, right? Like I hire a third party of QA folks like Indie Brothers that can come in and at least give you a few more numbers than just an internal 1 to 3 people, 1 to 5 people, etc., that you might have, which is generally not enough for comprehensive quality assurance on a game. So that is, I think I'm hitting, what am I missing? Am I missing any particular areas? I mean, obviously you can get into really, really specifics, like specific jobs. Like you can even have like an economist come in and help you in certain areas of like you're building an economy in your game. Like, there's various different things that like, you wouldn't necessarily normally have, but like I've heard of, different very specific types of designers. Obviously narrative designers. We didn't mention writers. We need to mention writers, of course, as well. Writing is a big part of that. A lot of times indies will like first time indies or kind of breakout indies will go lighter on the story. They will not have it necessarily a heavy script, but they'll relate a lot of it in the design. Like, so that's like the narrative design, right? The designer is thinking about how to portray the story, maybe without a lot of words, like a lot or like a few statements. Yep, UI design and programming, user experience, in terms of the enjoyment the player has in each of the systems and each of the areas of the game. So I mean, these are a lot of things that will get packed out. All these like things that we're saying, will get packed down to just a couple of people a lot of times, or a handful of people. And this is why a lot of people don't get into indie games, because it's a lot of work. There's a lot of areas that you have to take on, and you either have to do it collaboratively with a team, which is a challenge in itself, right? When you collaborate, the more people you collaborate with, the harder it is for me to get a clean, finished, awesome product completed. It takes more effort because of all the communication that has to go on, and potentially the conflicts, the discussions and all that kind of stuff, and differences of opinion that can come into play as well. Not that that's a negative thing. It just takes more work. You know what I mean? Like, it's more work to have the more people you have on. And I'm seeing that firsthand working with Vertigo, because we have to communicate with, X amount more people than we're used to, not just internally, but because we have platform partners, advertising partners, streaming partners. There's a lot of extra communication that goes into a lot of this kind of stuff that you definitely want to keep in mind. And you don't want to this is also something that developers do a lot of times as indies, is go, I'll do the marketing myself. And they don't think about how that is a job in itself, how the idea of having a list of people to contact is something that is hard to obtain in the first place. And if you're not able to just obtain it, you're going to have to build it out yourself. That takes a really, really long time. And it's just likely one of those things that you're going to have to really consider and think about in the moments that it's really important as you get closer to your game's release. What areas need support, right? Like need what areas of development need the support that you maybe can get a bit yourself, or if you can't do it yourself, like where are the additional like support beams coming in from, like third party or whatever.
Missy was saying, what are some common misunderstandings about the different roles you see within a lot of indie projects, and who are there to help them iron it out? Publisher, Indie Bros PR, and then she also said, I would expect that next to graphics and music, marketing might be harder than people expect. And I think that's true. I have seen more than a few developers just like, I hate sending emails out to people. I hate it. I'm like on the 5th email and I just want to go back to programming, or I want to go back to whatever else you're working on.
It's not exactly, the marketing side of things, it's not exactly rocket science. It just takes hard work. It takes effort. And a lot of times you're just not going to have the mental capacity or physical capacity to take that on, or it's not, or you shouldn't. It's not healthy for you to do that, and people still do, and we all, a lot of us push too far, I know, but and I mean I'm guilty of it as well at times, so I totally understand. But my point is that like we've talked about burnout before. We've talked about like when you release a game, you want to be as fresh as possible and not just completely just wrecked and not able to really be as responsive or be as mentally sharp as you could be during a time, a really important time, right? Like a really critical time for your game where people are, you know, making statements or potentially reaching out to you to give you additional exposure, you know, little opportunities that you just do not want to let slip through your fingers because you took all of this on and it was way too much and you got to the finish line but barely, and now you're a complete, you know, burned out wreck, or you're sick or whatever, and that kind of stuff. So it happens, and those kind of things are really important to think about. What are the common misunderstandings about what are common misunderstandings about the different roles you see within a lot of indie projects? I think a lot of people don't understand that, you know, a lot of people are doing multiple things at the same time. A lot of people are wearing like several hats at the same time. I love the idea that one of my old buddies, Ichiro for Arcen Games, had on his business card. He was the CEO / janitor of his company and stuff like that because he owned a studio, and he had to, at the end of the day, he had to throw away the trash. And and so it was something that I think he put on there to kind of like humble himself, as like, or just like as a humbling thing as well. It's like he's like, yeah, I own this company, but I also have to just, you know, I have to take out the trash and stuff like for it to make sure that we keep going and stuff. There are different hats that you like, you know, people have to wear, and like people who are at the higher ups at the indie studios, like don't get the idea that they're not getting their hands dirty anymore. They most certainly are. They're most likely working really hard on things and trying to, you know, in addition to that, figure out how to run a company comprehensively and cohesively with, you know, maybe half a dozen, dozens of people. So it's pretty intense to think about it like that. I think that's a misunderstanding a lot of people see when they see people who are not directly involved with the development aspects of the game. So they get on the marketing side, or producers, or business managers. The amount of, if it's a really popular game in particular, or a game that has a lot of a lot of buzz around it, then the conversations that you have to have externally with like other companies and something is like a job in itself, I feel like at times. And it's certainly something I do for Vertigo. And it's getting to the point of being like ad nauseum, like that's almost like the main focus of my job, is to have these conversations with like outside companies and consider whether or not working with them is worth our time, is valuable to us. Fresh during release sounds like utopia. Yeah, devs, it is definitely perfect world. You're never going to be totally fresh for a release. I mean, maybe if you're a master wizard of self-control and all that kind of stuff, maybe, you know what I mean? But, you know, anxieties, last minute things come up, not sleeping well, it happens, right? Like that's not that big of a deal. But you can avoid setting yourself up for a disaster, I think is the point. Like you can avoid like putting yourself in a position that you pretty much can guarantee you're going to be extraordinarily wiped out when you get to launch. And that's bringing in other you know, kind of other people, assistance, obviously preparation, planning ahead of time and knowing what needs to get done, and understanding that there are going to be things that pop up that you don't anticipate. Devs I spoke around, those days are stressed and sleep deprived. Yeah, oh yeah, 100%. 9 out of 10 devs are going to be that, right? Like, and this is why I am pushing for the opposite. I would love to see a world where we can, you know, get into a better preparation for this kind of thing because of the experiences we've gone through. We've already gone through this the hard way, guys. So let's think about this as we go into it. It's tough though, making deadlines, you know, hitting those deadlines, keeping them, you know, trying to avoid crunch in the process. Not something that I think indies put themselves through crunch, right? We talk about crunch on the AAA level versus the indie level. AAAs are kind of forcing individual workers that may or may not want to crunch or leave their job. Indies just do it to themselves, like it's masochistic, like it's self-mutilation essentially. So that's something that, as an indie developer, you have to understand that you have control over this. Like you have control over extending deadlines, pushing things back. Yes, if you have platform partners and things like that, things have to those people have to be considered, those entities have to be considered, and all that kind of stuff. If you've made public statements about when you're going to release, that has to be taken into consideration as well. But that doesn't mean you can't like hit the brakes a little bit if things are out of control or it's just in a bad spot. Nobody is generally expecting you to do anything like that. Like and it's generally not going to ruin your release to push it back. Most of the time, it's the other way around, right? Right, like releasing too soon, too early. Those are the things you cannot take back. So it's just something to keep in mind. Missy says, I do agree. I try to remember them to enjoy that special day in some way, even if it's just a deep breath and be proud you made it to that day. And that's another thing. You just can't smell the roses if you're already just totally wrecked, like just completely barely able to be responsive. And the key thing is with a Steam launch, if you're already tired going into it, once the game launches, you will not be able to keep your eyes off of the social media, Steam, and kind of YouTube/Twitch rigmarole that you're going to be doing, Googling and stuff like that of your game. Like you might forget to eat. I've forgotten to eat lunch. You know what I mean? Like when on those days, because you just get so locked into the dopamine of a new tweet or a new new impressions, and it's just coming in at such a rate that you like want to continue and keep up with everything. So that's
it's exciting.
Yeah, but it's good to know. It's good to think, or to have someone like with Vertigo. David knows he has me when he leaves, steps away, that I'm going to be looking at that too, and I know when I step away, he's going to be there as well, and that's really helpful for us because it says there you can step away and it's okay, and you should step away because like it's such an intensive thing to try to lock into, and even if you were fresh as a daisy going into launch day, you'll probably be exhausted after like those first 48 hours because you're not going to be necessarily taking care of yourself perfectly versus just being locked into what's going on, right in front of you as in real time as statistics and other things come in.
So one of the things I think is a pretty big misunderstanding about the different roles is people. Like you hire people to do specific jobs, and once ball's rolling, everybody's on the same page. Sometimes you get that thing where you have to check everything. You have to micromanage. You have to be on top of it. You got to let people do their jobs. You have to be okay with saying, "Here, this is what I need done. Handle it," and you know that they're going to handle it. And being able to delegate and not try to still take on everything yourself when you have all these other people around you to do the jobs, to do the work. That's an important thing that I think a lot of people have a hard time with, because it's their babies, their creation. They don't want to let other people have any agency over it.
Yeah, this is 100% philosophical, but the best teams I've ever been a part of were like is it autonomous, in terms of how the work was. Like there wasn't like we know who the boss is, but they're not the boss. Like they're just want someone else fulfilling the role that they have to fulfill. And we are we're all individually filling in our roles, and we come together and we have to be egoless about it because sometimes certain things that we bring to the table get cut and don't make it into the final project, and we have to be okay with that. That ties in with TV, what you said about the person's vision, whose vision it is. That's really important when you jump onto a project. If it's not directly your vision, then you have to be okay with certain, sacrifices that maybe have to be made on your work, based on, the vision that the original person has. Of course, you can put input and feedback into that vision, and you should, that as one of the main parts of the creation of that vision. You definitely should. But just the ownership of that vision is a very important aspect of the game itself, and respecting the original vision as best possible, unless it's just completely not working. Then you have to be upfront about that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's just one of those things that to keep in mind. Yeah, cool.
So I'm trying to think if there's anything else really to not to necessarily cover, but any other specific jobs that we've just kind of overlooked. I mean, we talked about programming, design, art, sound, writing, marketing, even a go-between between people. As far as a marketing standpoint, I mean, we talk about this often enough because it's something that we deal with and we do all the time. And I think the biggest thing that people don't realize, and again, we say this often enough, and I always want to reiterate it because it's super important. You know, companies like the Indie Brothers and all the other PR firms out there that do stuff that we do, or things adjacent, they've had years to work with several developers, several publishers, whatever, over the years, and they developed and built up their list. If nothing else, they have a massive tens of thousands of lists of various different content creators. They have people specifically scouring the internet for new ones and reaching out, and it's something that you cannot really do as a individual person or even just a developer. You can try, you can do certain things, but that's why oftentimes I'll even see, and it's always a little weird when I see it, but being on the content creation side of things, I'll see the same game and I'll get emails from different like PR firms, which is not that common, but it does happen, and it's like, what are they doing?
Doubling down a little bit on it, yeah.
And it's they're trying to reach a broader audience, I guess, and maybe the PR outreach, where they reach out to content creators specifically, maybe that's really cheap for one company, and another company's handling a bunch of other stuff along with the PR outreach, so they're trying to fill as many holes as possible. But
I can see doing that like on differing like announcements, but at the same time, you're like you said, you have a lot of potential duplicate stuff going out, which is not the end of the world, but it can create some or friction for the person receiving it.
That kind of feels like not having a plan for marketing until way later in the game than you should, and just kind of throwing everything at the wall and
that could be
hoping you've covered everything.
Which might happen. You know what I mean? Which you have to be aware of, and in that situation, you have to be. We are used to that with our company. We're used to the idea that someone, a developer, has kind of woken up a little bit late on it and be like, "Oh crap!" and I need your guys' help. So it's not that you can't accomplish things with that going on, but that's not optimal. We've talked about this before. The preparation ahead of time
go
can
check
be
last
so
week's discussion.
key.
In fact, we gave you guys a bunch of resources last week.
Right.
That should help with some of that too if you can't reach out directly.
Right, and the preparation can be so key because it just gives you the chance to not have to worry about a lot of that stuff when there's a lot of other things that could be going on in those critical, weeks or a couple of months leading up to your launch. Again, you want your focus to be where it needs to be, as opposed to being pulled to areas that maybe you could have already figured out by that time.
I'm sorry, I was trying to find something specific that Missy said.
But this is why we
out there to help them iron out the misconceptions or the misunderstandings about the different roles. Is it just within the team internally? Is it the publisher? Would it be a PR firm? I don't really think that's under something like we would do. We wouldn't walk into a thing and be like, hey, you need to step back and let them do, so who would actually be able to help, or is that just an internal thing?
I mean, you could obviously get consulting on it. Like, you could probably find some consultants to come in and say, and give you a review, that kind of thing. I mean, that's to me only necessary if you, as the owner, founder, creative director, etc., aren't able to, you're not able to figure that out yourself over your experiences together. Is it going to go perfect the first time together as a team? Like, almost certainly not, right? Like, not everything is going to be optimal. Not everything is going to be the way you want it to be. And by the end of a project, as you're transitioning into another project, as you sort of review, how everything went, you might say, okay, going forward, I don't want this to be the case. I want this to be I want to change this aspect or this process, or the way we do pipelining, or et cetera. Then you have to have that conversation with the individual or individuals that are involved with that. And moving forward, you have to have that new understanding of this is the way we're going to do this going forward. And we all feel like this is like an optimization. Like we've iterated into a better situation for everybody involved, and that's going to help us make better games. So I think that comes to mind when I hear something like that. I hope that answers the question more or less. I'm seeing Missy say, are porting teams to different platforms a thing for indies? Yesterday I saw Xbox having a team for helping indies. Is that enough for a developer who never ported their game? There are porting teams, and a lot of times you'll see porting teams for like not just for consoles, but like I know Among Us just came out on VR and a completely different development team for the VR release than Inner Sloth was on that. You'll see that for a lot of different big games that come out on, or like games that blow up that are like wanted on throughout like all across all platforms. Generally speaking, you can port to consoles on your own. It is a little bit of a headache, similar to what we talked about with owning a company and sort of what that entails. I think part of that is having to work to get your games on multiple platforms and storefronts. And Steam, Epic Game Store, Humble Store, Nintendo Switch, Xbox. The current generations of Xbox platforms, the current generations PS4, PS5 for PlayStation. So like these are all very like completely different companies that you have to connect with and then get access to their systems. We talked about Steamworks last week, right? Like the importance of getting a Steamworks account. Like when you get that, those are completely different things. Obviously, there's no Steamworks for Switch, right? Like you have to work with their system, their version of their backend, and I can tell you they are all wildly different. And there is no necessarily standards or status quos that you can rely on, or at least not as many as you would hope for. So that can be pretty intense to have to do that porting process by yourself. So it's something to think about. A lot of times, Switch, like getting your game onto Switch, will take certain aspect ratios into consideration that you may want to bring someone in to help with if you don't feel confident that you can do that yourself. Also, like the way controllers work, the way some of the UI and user experiences work on Xbox, PlayStation, and Switch are something to take into consideration. I know PS5 has some really cool, really intense, weird features that if you're thinking about how they relate to your indie game, you might find some connections to make that PS5 release something extra special for that indie game, because it uses certain, you know what I mean, Bumpy, all the different features of the controller that has, like where you can
the adaptive feedback triggers.
Yeah, right. All those kind of stuff. Yep. And that's something I think really important to think about when you're porting to a platform. Is that what's special about that platform, right? And is the game like, can your game utilize like those special features, right? Yeah. So that's something to think about. I know there's people and teams out there that have made their living off of porting games. So that they exist very similar in the space like Indie Brothers exists. Not everybody relies on us, but a lot of people do, and it makes sense that some people would want to say, pass. I don't want to do this stuff on my own. I want to find someone. I want to bring someone in to do it for me. Well, so that does happen, I think.
I know. I think it was Ease 8 from Nyan Falcom and then NIS America. They released it originally on PlayStation. It was really, it's a really great game, and they were going to bring it to PC, and then it got delayed, and then it got delayed again, and they got delayed again. It was delayed. I don't want to say like a year and a half, maybe even more than that. And it was because they tried just porting it themselves, and they were unable to really do it because for whatever reason. So they ended up having to get some famous person who does porting, is like really big into that thing, and they got him to basically have to redo from scratch like two or three times or something like that before everything got all put together and working right, and then they brought it to PC. So yeah, there's definitely teams for that. And another thing, when she mentioned porting, I was also thinking localization could be another thing to consider as maybe a different job role.
Yeah, localization is a good point. That's often external, or externally related. Like you'll find a team that does translations and localizations for games, and then you'll have someone like maybe the producer, creative director, etc., integrate those texts that they get from the localization companies into their store pages and the games themselves. Oftentimes, if they do the full localization, like store page localizations. At the very least, worth doing, and a lot of times people will look out and reach out for single project or a single action consultants and stuff. They could just do one. Like, I just need your help on one particular assignment kind of thing, and they'll put that together for them, like with like a store page. for Latin America, etc.
Likewise, we've glossed over it. We mentioned a few times, but not specifically as a job role, but even voice acting. That's another one that we didn't really include.
For sure, that's something that you bring in if you feel like your game, if the game requires it or is made better from that aspect. Cooks Are Delicious has one's voice acting consisted of David going things like that, and like Cooks Are Delicious 3 and Cooks Are Forever, I have like completely professionally hired voice actors doing their thing, and it's quite a cool thing to see the evolution of that. But the point is that you can start. You don't have to start with voice acting, like, or professional voice acting or anything like that. Just kind of understand. David understood with CSD1 those little grumbles and stuff were just fine for what he needed to accomplish. And as he continued to move forward with CSD3 and now Forever to accomplish the stories and the characters that he wants to, it requires going out and getting professional voice actors to get that done.
This would have been like a perfect transition if we still had any time to like get into scope and how that factors, like dealing with scope and dealing with the size of your team. But I think at this point it's going to be a whole chat on its own, because it's kind of features that you can improve a lot of games, but you can also do without. So
yeah, I mean, it boils down to me when you mentioned that in the chat when we were talking about it earlier or this week. It boils down for me that just on the fly, how good are you at assessing the project management? Like how things are going, how things are working. Are you achieving your goals like you want to? Are you hitting the quality bars that you want to? And is keeping things the same way that they have been the best thing going forward, or do things need to be shaken up, or new additions, etc., have to be made? Those are things that I feel like you have to check in with, kind of like almost ad nauseum at first, and then as you get further into the project, you can kind of relax a little bit and say, okay, I don't have to necessarily be on top of that as much, because we are now heading in the right direction because of that ad nauseum checking earlier on in the process. It really is something that I've been a part of projects that halfway, I think, through development, as in more than 9 months into development, big pieces were chopped, just deleted, and or irrevocably changed, like to completely different systems, So they definitely have to be anticipated, like those kind of decisions. You hope that you don't have to make them. You hope that your original design is really sound from paper and page to actual implementation, but you can't guarantee that, without actually going through that process, right? Like, it sounds fun on paper, but you don't know until you actually have the controller in your hand and it's been built out by the programmer and you're actually playing it, etc. So it's just things like that. Like, you have, to me, it's like your head has to be on a swivel all the time and ready to say, you know what, this isn't working. We're going to change some things, and I don't care if it upsets people. Like, as in, like, you don't want to upset people, but it's like, but what if Jeff in programming is going to be like, oh, that's going to be more work, or that kind of stuff. It's like, you have to sometimes for the better of the project. So, and generally Jeff in programming is happy to be paid, so he's not going to be upset about it. Generally speaking, if he's experienced, he knows this is coming anyway. No worries, Jeff.
So Missy said, you like how you also have parties that make physical releases. It is for super rare games. Yeah, like Manifold Garden had a physical release. And there are companies that do specialize in that as well, because that's not done very much outside of AAA games these days.
Yeah, the one that comes to mind is Limited Run. They do, as their company describes, a limited run of your physical release, a physical release on your game. There are vinyl records for soundtracks, like vinyl companies that will do vinyl designs and build out vinyl soundtracks for your. That will be limited edition. That I think I've worked with companies on that before. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that, obviously ancillary, that you could add on to your development aspects and give that extra boost potentially. But it's not something that I'm like, even on the Cooks Are Delicious side, we invested heavily into merch at one point and it did not pay off. So it's not something that, as an indie, I'm saying, hey, go get a bunch of your merch, unless people are literally pounding at your Discord door and saying, I want to give you money for this or that. Why doesn't it exist? And not just one person, but a lot of people have to be making that kind of clamor for that to to sort of be justified, because manufacturing merch is very expensive actually. It costs in the tens of thousands a lot of times, and you have to make a certain amount a lot of times for the manufacturer for it to be worth their while, right? For them to even do the project in the first place. So look for opportunities that you don't have to spend that much money on to produce certain physical aspects of your game. If people are interested in that, but there has to be an interest for it to begin with.
All right, I think we're gonna wrap it here. Is there any final thoughts before we do?
We covered more than I thought. It was kind of go, go, go.
All right, well, that's good. So next week we are going to be going into networking do's and don'ts, and hopefully we'll have some insightful stuff to share with you guys there. And
I think we all have experiences in networking do's and don'ts. That should be a good conversation next week.
That should be. All right, and then that's going to do it for us. Hopefully you all had some fun. You guys got to hear some interesting thoughts and maybe picked up some knowledge that you didn't hear before. You can always find us at theindiebros.com. Theindiebros.com. Say it a little clearer there. And we can help you guys out if you're going to be releasing a game anytime in the next 2 years, I guess. Something along those lines. So check it out, and we'll see you guys next week. Bye.